Inside a quiet, pastel-colored bedroom, investigators found a scrap of paper that would shatter the clinical peace of the British medical world. "I am evil." The jagged handwriting read, "I did this." These words didn't belong to a career criminal, but to a woman who spent her shifts in a blue uniform, entrusted with the survival of the most vulnerable beings imaginable. Lucy Letsby was the nurse parents thanked in their darkest hours. Yet behind the sterile masks and the soft hum of incubators, she was a predator, turning a sanctuary of life into a private gallery of horrors. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story of the most prolific child serial killer in modern British history doesn't begin in the shadows of a broken home or through the lens of a traumatic childhood. It begins in the quiet, picturesque cathedral city of Hereford, nestled near the border of Wales. Born in January 1990, Lucy Letsby was the only child of John and Susan Letsby, a couple who, by all accounts, viewed their daughter as a miracle. Her upbringing was the definition of middle-class stability. Her father worked as a retail manager and her mother as an accounts clerk. They were a tight-knit, almost insular trio. In the years that followed, neighbors would describe a family that was perfectly ordinary, unremarkable in every sense of the word. There were no outbursts, no scandals, and no hints of the darkness that would later define their family name. Lucy was the first in her family to seek higher education, a point of immense pride for her doting parents. She moved roughly 90 miles north to the University of Chester to study nursing. During her time as a student, she was seen as studious, quiet, and perhaps a bit plain. She wasn't the life of the party, nor was she a social pariah. She occupied that vast beige middle ground of human personality. She was meticulous in her studies, showing a specific driven interest in the neonatal field, a branch of medicine that requires an almost superhuman level of patience and a gentle touch. To those around her, her career choice seemed like a noble calling, a way for a kind girl to give back to the world. After graduating in 2011, she transitioned seamlessly into a full-time role at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The facility served a large catchment area across Cheshire and North Wales, and its neonatal unit was a point of local pride. Lucy wasn't just a nurse, she was a specialist. She underwent extra training to work in intensive care, the Level 2 nursery, where the most fragile infants, those born prematurely or with life-threatening conditions, were kept in a state of precarious balance. By her early 20s, she was one of the unit's golden girls. She was often the face of the hospital's fundraising campaigns. In one particularly haunting photograph from 2013, she is seen holding a tiny baby's outfit, smiling at the camera with an expression of pure clinical benevolence. She was the nurse who would stay late, the one who would take the extra shifts no one else wanted, and the one who always volunteered for the night shifts, the quiet hours when the rest of the world was asleep. Her social life in Chester mirrored her professional, vanilla persona. She lived in a small, well-kept, semi-detached house on Westbourne Road, which she purchased for herself. She attended salsa dancing classes, went to the gym, and enjoyed nights out at the pub with her colleagues. Her bedroom was decorated with stuffed animals, framed quotes about shining bright, and colorful fairy lights. It was the room of a woman who seemed to be clinging to the innocence of childhood, a stark contrast to the grueling, life and death reality of her daily work. Her parents remained a constant, almost suffocating presence in her life. They would drive up from Hereford to help her with her garden or take her out for dinner. She messaged them constantly, detailing the mundane aspects of her day. To the outside world, Lucy Letsby was the success story of a small-town girl who had made it in the big city, a dedicated professional who had found her purpose in the sterile, hum-filled corridors of the hospital. But beneath this meticulously maintained mask of normalcy, something was festering. Colleagues noticed she had a strange fondness for the high-drama cases. When a baby collapsed, Lucy was often the first one there, her movements calm and clinical, while others panicked. She developed an intense, almost obsessive interest in the families of the children she cared for. She wasn't just monitoring the infants, she was monitoring the parents' grief. In the digital age, this obsession left a trail. She would spend her private hours searching for the families of her victims on social media, sometimes even on the anniversaries of their children's deaths. She was building a secret library of their pain, tucked away behind the likes and shares of a normal 20-something's life. The transition from a dedicated nurse to a calculated predator didn't happen overnight, but by the spring of 2015, the atmosphere in the neonatal unit began to shift. The air grew heavy with a series of inexplicable tragedies that would soon defy every law of medicine. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital functioned like a self-contained ecosystem, a high-stakes sanctuary where time was measured not in hours, but in the steady, rhythmic pulses of monitors. To step through the double-secured doors was to enter a world of muted blue light, the sharp scent of isopropyl alcohol, and a persistent, mechanical hum that never truly ceased. It was a landscape of plastic and glass, where infants weighing as little as 2 pounds, barely the size of a human hand, clung to existence inside the warm, humid air of the incubators. This was Lucy's domain. She was a fixture of Nursery 1, the intensive care room where the most critical cases were managed. In this room, the margin for error was non-existent. The air was thick with the concentrated effort of survival. Every breath a hard-won victory. The staff here were more than colleagues. They were a work family, bound together by the unique trauma and triumph of watching life begin at its most precarious edge. There was a profound sense of camaraderie that only exists in environments where death is a constant, uninvited guest. Lucy was expertly integrated into this sisterhood. She was the nurse who never hesitated to pick up a grueling night shift on a weekend, the one who would stay back to help with a difficult admission without being asked. Her peers saw her as a safe pair of hands, a woman whose clinical efficiency was matched by a quiet, unassuming nature that made her easy to work alongside. She was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who organized the staff Christmas parties, and the one who was always available on the unit's group text threads to offer a supportive word or a piece of gossip. Socially, Lucy appeared to be flourishing in a way that felt entirely wholesome. She was a regular at the local pub, the Mock Beggar Hall, where she would decompress with other nurses over glasses of cider. She spoke of her love for salsa dancing and her plans for her next holiday. There was nothing in her digital footprint, the photos of her smiling with friends or her posts about her favorite television shows, that suggested a fractured psyche. She was a normal 25-year-old woman living a normal life. Yet looking back, some colleagues recalled a specific intensity to her professionalism. She seemed to crave the high dependency cases, the level 2 infants who required the most technical intervention. While other nurses found the constant alarms and the delicate titration of fluids exhausting, Lucy moved through the chaos with a chilling, detached precision. The intensive care nursery was a theater of minute details. A nurse's shift was a constant cycle of monitoring, checking the placement of nasogastric tubes, measuring the output of tiny catheters, and ensuring the infusion pumps delivered life-sustaining medications at a rate of just a few milliliters per hour. Lucy was a master of these machines. She understood the intricacies of the ventilators and the sensitivity of the heart rate monitors. She was often the one who would alert a doctor to a subtle change in a baby's grunting, the labored breathing that signals a collapse. Her clinical notes were legendary for their neatness and detail. She documented everything, or so it seemed. In reality, the unit's culture of absolute trust was her greatest shield. Because she was so well liked, because she was so helpful, no one thought to look closer when she was the common denominator in a room where things began to go wrong. The social mesh of the unit was also an information network, and Lucy was a sponge for the personal lives of the families she served. She didn't just care for the infants, she inserted herself into the narrative of the parents' lives. She would sit with mothers for hours, listening to their fears, offering a level of empathy that felt, at the time, like extraordinary kindness. She was the nurse who would take the memory photos for parents if a baby was failing, capturing the tiny footprints, or the first, and sometimes last, time a mother held her child. It was a role that granted her access to the rawest, most private moments of human grief. To her colleagues, she was a compassionate pillar. To the parents, she was an angel. But as 2015 progressed, the atmosphere in that sterile sanctuary began to curdle. The The bad luck the unit seemed to be experiencing wasn't distributed evenly. It followed a pattern, a shadow that seemed to lengthen whenever Lucy was on the roster. Outside of the hospital, Lucy's life remained a picture of domestic stability. Her small house on Westbourne Road was less than a 10-minute drive from the unit, a proximity that allowed her to be at the hospital almost as much as she was at home. She lived alone, but her house was filled with the clutter of a woman who was still very much a daughter. Her parents visited frequently, their relationship bordering on the codependent. They were her emotional anchor, a connection so tight that Lucy often felt a profound sense of guilt for being away from them. This pressure to be the perfect daughter and the perfect nurse created a strange, compressed interior world. She was the girl who did everything right, the one who never made mistakes. But inside the quiet of the neonatal unit, under the cover of the night shifts and the clinical routine, a different Lucy was beginning to emerge. One who found a dark, intoxicating power in the ability to decide when a heartbeat should end. The camaraderie she had worked so hard to build served a dual purpose. It provided her with a social life, but it also ensured that any whisper of suspicion was immediately dismissed by her peers as unthinkable. If a doctor questioned a sudden collapse, Lucy was right there, nodding in agreement about how strange and tragic it was. She played the part of the grieving professional to perfection, sometimes even crying alongside her colleagues when a baby died. This shared mourning served to bind her even tighter to the group. She wasn't just a nurse, she was a survivor of the unit's collective trauma. No one could have known that the woman they were comforting in the break room had just hours before been the one to introduce the very air that stopped a child's heart. The sanctuary was becoming a hunting ground, and the very walls designed to protect life were now being used to conceal its systematic destruction. The silence of the night shift was usually a comfort, but in the summer of 2015, it became a shroud. The first shadow fell on June 8th. It began with baby a twin boy born at 31 weeks, weighing just 3 pounds and 12 ounces. He was stable. He was breathing on his own. He was doing well. Then Lucy Letsby took over his care. Within minutes of her starting her shift, the monitors flatlined. The room exploded into a frantic, high-stakes choreography of resuscitation, but the baby's heart refused to restart. A senior doctor noticed a strange phenomenon, purple-red splotches migrating across the infant's skin. It was a clinical anomaly, something none of the veteran staff had ever seen. He was pronounced dead within 90 minutes. Less than 28 hours later, the nightmare repeated. Baby B, the twin sister of the boy who had just died, suffered a sudden, catastrophic collapse. The same strange mottling appeared on her limbs, cyanotic blue and angry red patches that vanished as quickly as they appeared. This time, the team managed to bring her back, but the seed of unease was planted. The doctors whispered about bad luck, but the odds of 2 twins collapsing in such quick succession without a clear medical cause were astronomical. Lucy was the one at the bedside. She was the one who had been there for the first death, and she was the one who raised the alarm for the second. The methods were as varied as they were calculated, designed to mimic natural causes or equipment failure. In the case of baby C, a tiny boy born at just 2 pounds, the attack was invisible. Investigators would later determine that air had been forced into his stomach via a nasogastric tube, a tube meant for life-sustaining milk. The pressure pushed his diaphragm against his lungs, making every breath a physical impossibility. He died in the early hours of the morning, his father watching helplessly as the kind nurse who'd been so supportive throughout the night stood by and watched the life drain out of him. By August, the attacks grew more daring. Baby E and Baby F were another set of twins. Baby E was a healthy, robust infant for his gestational age. His mother walked into the nursery unexpectedly to find her son screaming, a sound no baby of his size should be able to make. He was bleeding from the mouth. Letsby stood over him, calm as a midsummer pond. She told the mother that the blood was merely from a tube irritation and urged her to go back to the ward. She told her to trust her. Hours later, baby E was dead. He had been attacked with a medical instrument, causing massive internal trauma and a fatal hemorrhage. Not content with one tragedy, Letsby targeted his brother, baby F, the following day. This time, she chose a biochemical weapon, insulin. She spiked a bag of parenteral nutrition with a massive dose of the hormone, causing the infant's blood sugar to crash to lethal levels. He survived, but the damage was irreversible. The pattern was a jagged line of impossible events. Stable babies. Babies who were literally hours away from being moved to lower dependency nurseries. Suddenly, switching off. In September, baby G, born at the very edge of viability at 23 weeks, had reached a milestone. She was 100 days old. The staff had celebrated with a cake. That same night, under Letsby's care, she suffered a violent projectile vomit that sent milk across the room. She had been overfed by force. Her tiny stomach expanded until it compromised her breathing. She suffered 2 more collapses over the following weeks. Each time, Letsby was the common denominator. The sensory details of these moments were etched into the memories of the surviving parents. The smell of the hand sanitizer as Letsby approached. The way her voice remained a soft, melodic whisper, even as she described a child's deteriorating condition. The persistent, high-pitched chime of the ventilators, a sound that usually meant help was needed, but in Lucy's presence often meant it was too late. One mother recalled Letsby's behavior after her daughter, baby I, died on the 4th attempt. The nurse volunteered to bathe the child. She did it with a strange performative tenderness. She then sent the mother a sympathy card, mentioning how honored she was to have cared for the little girl. In early 2016, the violence shifted to baby K. A doctor walked into the nursery to find the infant's oxygen levels plummeting. The alarm was silent. Letsby was standing over the incubator, doing nothing. She didn't call for help. She didn't pick up the resuscitation bag. She simply watched the monitor. When the doctor asked what had happened, she told him the baby had just started to desaturate. It was a bold, almost arrogant display of her power. She was testing the limits of their suspicion. By June 2016, the frequency of deaths reached a fever pitch. Within a single week, 2 brothers from a set of triplets, baby O and baby P, died under mysterious circumstances. Baby O suffered severe liver damage, an injury typically seen in high-velocity car accidents, not in a climate-controlled incubator. Letsby had physically assaulted him. The next day, his brother collapsed. A doctor, now deeply suspicious, begged for the triplets to be moved to another hospital. He told his superiors he didn't feel the infants were safe in Chester. His plea was ignored, and baby P died shortly after. The stable paradox remained the most haunting aspect of the investigation. These were not children at the end of their lives. They were children at the beginning. They were babies who were crying for their feeds and pink and warm just minutes before they turned gray and cold. The methods, air embolisms, insulin poisoning, physical trauma, and overfeeding were chosen because they were difficult to detect during a standard autopsy. Air dissolves, insulin is processed, milk is just milk. The nursery, once a place of hope, had become a site of ritualized cruelty. Letsby wasn't just killing, she was playing a game with the medical staff, a game where the stakes were the lives of children and the prize was her own sense of twisted significance. She was the hero of every tragedy. She was the one who held the grieving mothers. She was the one who laid out the tiny bodies. She was the author of the very pain she pretended to soothe. The atmosphere in the unit was no longer just heavy. It was toxic. The nurses were exhausted. The doctors were terrified. And in the center of the storm sat Lucy, her notes neat, her uniform pressed, and her eyes fixed on the next name on the roster. The sheer volume of air injected into these infants was staggering. In baby N's case, the air was forced so deep into his tissues that it caused his throat to swell, making it impossible for doctors to insert a breathing tube. The physical struggle of these infants was immense. They fought for every ounce of oxygen, their tiny hearts racing until they simply gave up. The terror of those moments, the silent screams of children who could not speak, was the dark reality behind the sterile clinical reports. The angel of death was no longer a metaphor. She was a living, breathing presence in the Countess of Chester Hospital, and she was far from finished. As the bodies of infants were being wheeled out of the neonatal unit, a different kind of darkness was taking root in the hospital's administrative wings. It was a malignancy of silence, a corporate shield forged from a desperate need to protect the institution's reputation at the cost of its patients' lives. The doctors on the front lines, specifically the lead consultants like Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jayaram, were living in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on paranoia. They weren't just clinicians anymore. They were accidental detectives, haunted by the Letsby name that appeared on every nursing roster and every resuscitation sheet like a recurring nightmare. The unease had begun as a whisper in June 2015, following the deaths of baby A, C, and D. Dr. Breary had flagged the unexplained and unusual nature of the collapses to the hospital's management, noting that a single nurse was present for every single event. He wasn't met with an urgent inquiry, but with a wall of administrative indifference. The nursing managers, including the head of the unit, Irian Powell, insisted that the data was circumstantial. They pointed to Lucy's exemplary record and her willingness to work the shifts no one else wanted. To the executives, Letsby wasn't a suspect. She was a victim of a witch hunt by arrogant doctors who couldn't accept their own clinical failures. By the spring of 2016, the atmosphere in the consultants' offices was one of stifled rage. The death toll was climbing, and every time the doctors raised their voices, the hierarchy pushed back harder. The director of nursing, Karen Reese, and the chief executive, Tony Chambers, seemed more concerned with the unit's Level 2 status and the potential for a public relations disaster than the mounting pile of tiny coffins. When Dr. Breary demanded that Letsby be removed from the ward after the deaths of the triplets in June, he was told that there was no evidence of foul play. The administrative response was to suggest mediation between the doctors and the nurse, as if the systematic killing of infants was a simple workplace disagreement. The most galling moment of this corporate cover-up came in early 2017. Instead of being arrested, Lucy Letsby was moved to a desk job in the Risk and Patient Safety Department, a move that felt like a dark irony to the doctors who knew the truth. But the insult didn't end there. Management, backed by the Human Resources Department, determined that the consultants had bullied Letsby by voicing their suspicions. In a scene that felt like it was stripped from a psychological thriller, the doctors, men who had spent their lives saving children, were ordered to write a formal letter of apology to the woman who was murdering them. They were told to sit in a room with her and clear the air, while the hospital executives looked on with satisfied expressions of conflict resolution. The frustration of the consultants was a physical weight. They were watching a predator hide in plain sight, protected by the very structures meant to ensure safety. For nearly a year after Letsby was removed from the ward, the hospital refused to involve the police. They commissioned an external review by the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, but the scope was limited. The reviewers weren't allowed to look for crime, only for service issues. Even when the review suggested that the deaths were indeed high, the board continued to stall. They didn't want the sirens. They didn't want the yellow tape. They wanted the problem to go away quietly, tucked into a file and forgotten. In the hallways of the Countess of Chester, the silence was deafening. The nurses who had worked alongside Lucy were divided, some still viewing her as a lovely girl who had been unfairly targeted, while others began to look back at the strange coincidences with a cold, creeping realization. The corporate shield was beginning to crack, not because of a sudden burst of morality from the administration, but because the doctors refused to be silenced. They bypassed the internal channels and made it clear that if the hospital wouldn't call the police, they would. It took 11 months from her removal for the sirens to finally arrive. 11 months of Letsby sitting in a comfortable office, accessing confidential patient files and planning her defense, while the families of the victims remained in the dark, told that their children had died of natural causes or unfortunate complications. The prelude to Operation Hummingbird wasn't a triumph of justice. It was a testament to the lethality of institutional ego, a period where the paperwork was prioritized over the pulse. In May 2017, the sterile silence of the hospital corridors was finally pierced by the arrival of the Cheshire Constabulary. The investigation, codenamed Operation Hummingbird, was unlike anything the department had ever handled. Detectives weren't looking for a body in an alley or a weapon in a river. They were diving into a sea of medical charts, infusion pump data, and nursing rosters. The team, led by Detective Inspector Paul Hughes, moved into a secure, windowless office, filling it with whiteboards that soon became a dizzying mosaic of names, dates, and shift patterns. The breakthrough didn't come from a single smoking gun, but from a mathematical inevitability. When the investigators overlaid the times of the 17 collapses and 7 deaths with the staff schedule, a single name emerged in every single instance, occupying the center of the Venn diagram of tragedy. Lucy Letsby was the only person present for every event. To the statisticians, it was an impossibility. To the detectives, it was a roadmap. On July 3rd, 2018, at 6 a.m., the Golden Girl persona was finally stripped away. The morning was cool and gray as police vehicles pulled up to the small, semi-detached house on Westbourne Road. The dawn raid was a study in jarring contrasts. Inside the home of Britain's most prolific child killer, officers found a world of arrested development. The walls were adorned with framed inspirational quotes and photos of her 2 cats, Tigger and Winnie. There were stuffed animals on the unmade bed and a Winnie the Pooh calendar on the wall. It looked like the room of a teenager, not a 30-year-old professional. But as the forensic teams began to peel back the layers of this dollhouse existence, they found the paper mountain. Under her bed, inside a series of decorative bags, and even in her kitchen trash, were 257 confidential handover sheets, sensitive medical documents that should never have left the hospital. Some were stained with blood. Others contained the minute-by-minute records of the very babies who had died under her care. She had kept them like trophies. The most chilling discovery, however, was tucked inside a green 2016 diary. It was a chaotic, scrawled post-it note, a frantic confession written in a hand that bore no resemblance to her neat clinical charts. "I am evil. I did this," the note screamed in jagged ink. "I don't deserve to live. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them. I am a horrible, evil person." Nearby, other scraps of paper were found where she had written, "Help me," and "I can't do this anymore." It was as if the mask had slipped in the privacy of her bedroom, revealing a fractured, self-loathing psyche that found its only relief in the destruction of others. While Letsby sat in a cell, maintaining a calm, almost bored demeanor during her initial interviews, the technical investigation deepened. Detectives brought in Dr. Dewey Evans, a specialized consultant with decades of experience, to review the medical records. Crucially, they gave him the charts blindly, without telling him which nurses were on duty for which cases. His independent findings were harrowing. He identified air embolisms, bubbles of air deliberately injected into the bloodstream, as the cause of death for several infants. He pointed to the extraordinary levels of insulin found in others, levels that could only have been achieved through deliberate poisoning. The digital forensic team uncovered another layer of the obsession. Letsby's Facebook history showed a woman who was addicted to the aftermath of her crimes. She didn't just kill the babies, she stalked their parents. She searched for the mothers on the anniversaries of their children's deaths. She searched for them on Christmas Day. On one occasion, she searched for the parents of a baby she had attacked just hours after the child was buried. She was feeding on their grief, returning to the scene of the emotional crime again and again from the safety of her smartphone. During the recorded interviews, Letsby was a chameleon. She spoke in a soft, monotone voice, often answering with a simple, "I don't recall," or "I can't say." When confronted with the "I am evil" note, she claimed it was merely the product of a woman in distress who felt she was being blamed for things beyond her control. She tried to frame herself as the victim of a systemic failure, a nurse who had seen too much death and was suffering from a breakdown. But her cool, clinical responses to the details of the air embolisms suggested otherwise. She was a woman who knew the machines, knew the chemistry, and knew exactly how much accident she could manufacture. The investigation lasted years, involving over 70 officers and thousands of hours of witness statements. They tracked her movements through her cell phone pings, her swipes on the hospital security doors, and the data logs of the heart rate monitors. Every piece of evidence pointed back to the same terrifying truth. The angel was a ghost in the machine, a woman who used her intimate knowledge of the hospital's vulnerabilities to turn a house of healing into a private morgue. By the time the formal charges were brought in 2020, the detectives realized they weren't just prosecuting a nurse. They were uncovering a systematic campaign of terror that had thrived in the shadows of institutional trust. The trial at Manchester Crown Court was a marathon of misery, as the jury was forced to relive every air bubble and every spiked bag. Lucy Letsby sat in the dock, a pale, diminished figure who had traded her clinical scrubs for a nondescript black cardigan. She remained largely emotionless, her face a mask of detached boredom, even as grieving parents recounted their final moments with their children just feet away. She denied every charge, maintaining that the deaths were the result of failing hospital infrastructure, a defense that eventually withered under the weight of the medical data and the damning notes found in her home. In August 2023, the verdicts finally arrived. She was found guilty of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder 6 more. The judge, noting her deep-seated malevolence, imposed multiple whole-life orders, the most severe sentence in the British legal system. A subsequent retrial in 2024 for the attempted murder of baby K resulted in another guilty verdict, ensuring she would never again breathe the air of a free world. Justice was served, but it provided little comfort to the families whose futures she had systematically erased. The corridors of the Countess of Chester Hospital remain silent, but the weight of what happened there is far from gone. The Thirlwall Inquiry is currently dismantling the institutional walls that allowed a predator to thrive, exposing a management culture that valued its image over the pulses of the infants in its care. Lucy Letsby's name has become a permanent synonym for a terrifying clinical void. She dismantled families, stole futures, and left nothing in her wake but a jagged, handwritten confession, a final, bitter testament to a tragedy that was as preventable as it was monstrous. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.